Barron Trump walked into the grand auditorium that morning, blending into the crowd as he took his seat at the prestigious academic conference. This was an event that gathered the brightest young minds in the country, a place where knowledge wasn't just shared, but fiercely debated. In this hall, students weren't afraid to challenge authority, and many were eager to prove their intellectual dominance. However, no one in that room could have predicted that the day's most unexpected debate was about to unfold. Silently, Barron took his seat in the third row. A few students took notice, whispering among themselves. Some assumed he was only there because of his last name, while others thought he was just an observer. What they didn't realize was that Barron Trump was there for a reason. Just like everyone else, he had come to prove himself through intellect, knowledge, and reason. Standing at the podium under the bright lights of the auditorium was Professor Richard Holloway. Holloway was notorious in the academic world for his sharp tongue and ruthless debating style. His intellectual authority didn't stem solely from his knowledge, but from the way he demolished his opponents in debate. His greatest weapon was his disdain for traditional beliefs, particularly religious values, which he viewed as outdated and irrational. That morning, Holloway was preparing to deliver one of his signature performances. Placing his hand on the podium, he adjusted his glasses and surveyed the audience with a knowing smirk before he began speaking. "Today, we are gathered here with some of the brightest minds in America," he declared. "But let's address something directly. Scientific studies have shown, time and time again, a clear pattern. The more intelligent a person is, the weaker their religious beliefs become. Or, to put it more simply, the more religious someone is, the less they actually think." A few chuckles rippled through the crowd. Holloway, fully in control, continued. "And this isn't just my opinion," he said, turning to gesture toward the massive screen behind him. A large graph appeared, showing a downward trend, an inverse correlation between education levels and religious belief. "As you can see," he continued, pointing at the screen, "the more people are educated, the more they move away from these myths. As reason and science advance, fewer and fewer people believe the stories of so-called prophets who claim to receive messages from the sky." Some students laughed, while others nodded in agreement. But Barron Trump remained perfectly still in his seat, his expression unreadable, his posture unwavering. Holloway scanned the room, his gaze briefly locking onto Barron. His smirk widened. "Of course, some people are an exception," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "For them, family traditions take precedence over logic and reason." He stared directly at Barron. "Isn't that right, Mr. Trump?" A murmur spread through the auditorium. This was a direct challenge. Barron's jaw tensed slightly, but his expression remained calm. With deliberate movements, he adjusted his suit and continued to hold his gaze steady on the professor, showing no signs of agitation. Holloway, clearly enjoying himself, pressed on. "Come on now, we have plenty of bright students here today," he said, his voice light and mocking. "Surely, someone in this room can explain why, in the year 2025, it still makes sense to believe in an invisible higher power?" A few students exchanged amused glances, already anticipating another one of Holloway's infamous takedowns. He had done this before, challenging believers, only to humiliate them in front of an audience. But then, Barron Trump slowly rose from his seat. The whispers and murmurs in the hall ceased instantly. No one had expected him to respond. But there he was, standing up, his movements composed and assured, as he began walking toward the podium. For the first time that morning, the smirk on Holloway's face wavered. He had assumed Barron would remain seated, unwilling to engage. Instead, he now faced a student who was clearly unafraid to challenge him. As Barron reached the podium, he adjusted the microphone and surveyed the room. Even before he spoke, his poised silence commanded the attention of every single person in the auditorium. Then, in a voice that was steady, precise, and unwavering, he spoke. "First of all, thank you, Professor Holloway," he said, his tone measured. "But I have to ask, how can someone who claims to be an advocate of science present intelligence and faith as opposing forces? Because that is not a scientific argument. That is personal bias." The auditorium fell completely silent. Holloway's smirk twitched slightly, his confidence shaken for the first time. He had expected an easy target. Instead, he had just encountered a far stronger opponent than he had anticipated. Barron Trump's words carried through the auditorium, not with anger or frustration, but with a calm, steady confidence that demanded attention. The students had expected a heated exchange, Yet what they witnessed was something far more powerful. Professor Richard Holloway removed his glasses, setting them on the podium with deliberate slowness. He studied Barron for a moment, then smirked. "So, you're suggesting that most scientists are wrong and that faith somehow correlates with intelligence?" he asked, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Barron shook his head. "No, Professor. I'm pointing out your flawed reasoning," he replied. "Science does not disprove faith. It presents data. But you are interpreting that data through your own biases, assuming correlation equals causation, an elementary mistake for someone of your academic standing." A hush fell over the room. Holloway's smirk faltered. Barron turned toward the screen. "Your chart only shows correlation, not causation. By your logic, increased ice cream sales would be responsible for rising crime rates because both increase in summer." A few chuckles rippled through the audience. Holloway cleared his throat. "If God exists and is all-powerful, why does science not prove his necessity?" "Because science is a tool, not an ultimate truth," Barron countered. "Quantum mechanics alone proves that our understanding of reality is incomplete. Yet, you speak as if all answers are already known. That is not science. That is dogma." For the first time, Holloway hesitated. The student sensed the shift. Barron stepped forward. Newton, Planck, Collins, all brilliant minds who saw faith and science as allies. Einstein himself said, "Science without religion is lame. Religion without science is blind." Are they all unscientific? Silence. Holloway exhaled sharply. "Are you saying science cannot explain everything?" Barron smiled. "I'm saying true scientists seek knowledge, not certainty." And in that moment, the debate had already been won. Barron Trump's final words had completely shifted the atmosphere in the room. This was no longer just an academic debate. It had become a battle of ideas. Professor Richard Holloway, who had long basked in his intellectual superiority, now felt it slipping away. But he wasn't going to retreat so easily. "So, what exactly are you saying, Mr. Trump?" Holloway asked, trying to regain his composure. "That science is inadequate and believing in God is a rational alternative?" Barron shook his head. "I'm merely pointing out the flaws in your reasoning, Professor," he replied. "Acknowledging that science hasn't explained everything isn't being anti-science. It's understanding the nature of science. If science truly had all the answers, then why are we still unable to fully explain the origins of the universe or the nature of consciousness?" Some students nodded in agreement. Holloway noticed this and quickly tried to regain control. "Ah, the classic God of the gaps argument," he scoffed. "Filling in the unknown with a divine explanation. That's intellectual laziness." Barron smiled. "Ironically, Professor, that's exactly what you're doing," he said. "You fill in the unknown by assuming God does not exist. True intellectual laziness is claiming to have all the answers." A murmur spread through the auditorium. Holloway's confident smirk faded. Barron's logic was his most powerful weapon, and Holloway could feel the debate slipping from his grasp. Barron took a deep breath, his voice growing even clearer. "Professor, your issue isn't with people of faith. Your issue is with your own unquestioned belief that you are absolutely right. True scientists don't cling to dogmas, they admit what they don't know." Holloway's face tensed, but he remained silent. The students were now fully focused on Barron. "Science is a tool for understanding meaning, but it is not meaning itself," Barron continued. "You have turned science into a dogma. But science, by definition, stands against dogma. If you truly value reason and intellectual honesty, at some point, you must ask yourself this question. What if I'm wrong?" Holloway opened his mouth but said nothing. The room fell into deep silence. After a long pause, he simply cleared his throat and attempted to change the subject. "All right," he said with a forced smile. "I suppose we can end it here. Let's get back to the lecture." But everyone knew. The lecture had already ended. Professor Holloway lowered his head to straighten his notes, but his fingers trembled slightly. What had just happened was unlike any debate he had ever encountered in his career. Until now, he had effortlessly convinced his students, crushing every opposing idea with ease. But today, for the first time, he found himself truly cornered by the words of the young man standing before him. Barron Trump, however, quietly took his seat as if nothing had happened. He didn't need to declare victory. Everyone in the room already knew. This wasn't just an ordinary debate. It was a shift in perspective. Holloway knew he had lost, but the real blow was not just his own realization. It was the fact that the entire class had seen it too. And at that moment, everyone in the room understood a simple truth. Some victories aren't won with applause, but with silence. Yet this silence was not just the end of a debate. It was the beginning of an awakening.